Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. I was lucky enough to have a conversation with my friend, the distinguished astrophysicist Lord Martin Rees, a few years ago on our podcast, but he more recently came out with a very interesting book about saving the world with science, and I thought it was a great opportunity to have him back to talk about the subjects in the book and to have a wide-ranging conversation far beyond astrophysics and its own background about the areas where science can impact on our lives and our future. And it was, as always, a very informative and lively discussion. He's a remarkable scholar, human being, and a real pleasure to talk to. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. And you can watch it ad-free on our Substack site if you're a Substack subscriber to Critical Mass. And I hope you'll consider doing that because those funds support the Origins Project Foundation. If you're not a subscriber, you can watch it on YouTube eventually, if you're a subscriber to our YouTube channel, or of course listen to it on any podcast listening site. No matter how you watch it or listen to it, I really hope you'll be informed and educated as much as I am every time I talk to Martin Rees. So enjoy this Origins podcast with Martin Rees. Let me just say first, thank you for coming back, Martin. This has been a fascinating conversation. I really think it's worth delving into, for the most part, of the second half of your book, which is about sort of the operation of science itself. But I do want to touch on a few issues just before we do that on AI that you mentioned that I think are intriguing. You do demonstrate as we have discussed that we both, you and I, think that AI is actually extremely useful and not so much of it, in principle, not immediately a terror, and like many people suggest, or an existential risk in the near term, as long as one is careful. The one thing that let me hit. There's a few statements you make that got me thinking again, or at least maybe I disagree with some. We've already talked about the win-win versus win-lose possibility. And in principle, AI will allow a win-win world, but I think in practice, it'll probably too often involve a win-lose world. Being pessimistic in that regard, of just about economic behavior and foresight. But when you talk about one of the limitations of AI, you say something interesting to me. You said learning. First of all, let's actually step back. When people think of AI, much of what AI does is not intelligence in any sense. It's sorting. It can sort and much more efficiently than human beings, and that gives it a great deal of power in certain areas. But it's not cognition in the same sense that we think of that. Do you agree with me there?
Yes. Well, it is calculation of a kind, isn't it? And
Yeah.
optimizing, but the main advantage is it can do these things about 1 million times faster
Yeah.
than a human. But of course, there are some things it can't do at all.
Yeah, exactly. There's some things it can't do at all. And there's certainly some things it doesn't do yet. Even when it appears to be very thoughtful, it's really just doing a very fast sorting of information that it's gotten. And and I guess one can have a debate. And as you know, in my new book, I talk about consciousness, about whether that's really thinking. But I think it's really just data analysis that's very, very fast, and that's great. And it's very useful for humans to have such things, and they can do it much better. For example, you did talk about AI taking over mind-numbing jobs, but as far as I can see, it would do a much better job, and many other things, including a lot of medicine, diagnostic medicine.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
the question is, and let me ask you, because the problem with AI is that it often learns the most effective route to something, but unlike you and I solving an astrophysics problem, we don't know how it did it. It's not as if there's some logical, clear way that it can tell you why this is the best route. So the question is, if AI became diagnostic doctors, and I think they do a better job than doctors on the average at some point in the future,
Yeah.
in terms of giving clinical diagnosis of treatment, would people be willing to take a diagnosis and particularly a proposed treatment from a black box without knowing why?
Um, well, I think they should be cautious about that because although on average it may do a good job, there could be some hidden uh, bugs in the program. So it sometimes shows some bias or does something wrong. So I think it's very dangerous to leave an AI to make decisions that affect us as humans, even in minor ways. I mean, whether it's in um, assessing job applicants, whether it's deciding if you're fit for parole if you're in prison, whether you're credit worthy, or things of that kind, or indeed whether you need surgery for some operation. It's true that in the case of radiology, the machine can look at 30,000 lungs and in a sense can do a better job there. But one hopes there's some real doctor there to verify that
Well,
it's not.
it's interesting. You have more faith in real doctors. I mean, the point is that doctors can also have biases and agendas.
Of course, yes.
Wouldn't the recommendation be simply to do what you tell people to do now, which is get a second opinion? Don't get one AI's opinion, but get a second one. As long as
Yeah,
they're independent, as long as they're not
yeah,
programmed the
yeah.
same.
No, that's a good idea. Yes. Yeah. Mm.
Okay, okay. Now, you did say learning about human behavior will be difficult because acquiring, quote, common sense won't be so easy for them. It involves observing actual people in real homes or workplaces. I'm wondering if that's also maybe not true, in the sense that an AI who reads enough history or learns enough or looks at the newspapers will inevitably sort of learn about how real people work in real places. And so wouldn't wouldn't it be no more difficult to learn about sort of how humans tend to respond to things by looking at millions and millions of human responses in literature and newspapers as it is to learn how whether a stoplight or whether a bicycle is a bicycle or a hydrant if you're a self-driving car?
Yes. I think it would, but of course the problem really is do you have enough data, and also I think the fundamental question of whether it's got any sort of concept of things or people, because this has come up recently in this new one that can write connected prose and all that. What it has done is looked at billions of pages of text and knows the correlation between words and phrases, etc., and can package them together. But there's no sense in which it really understands the things that those words refer to.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's an impediment. So although the machines can do a lot, and they can, as you say, they can help with diagnosis, and they can deal with something which is all numbers, like the stock market,
Mm-hmm.
or deal with the economy. And I say in my book that they could give a planned economy in China of a kind that Marx would only dream of, because
Yeah.
they can analyze all the data which they have in China, and so can do that. But the question is, does it really have a sense of real people?
Yeah, no, in fact, as you probably I know since you wrote a blurb for my book, my new book, and in thinking about consciousness and learning a lot about it, one of the one of the remarks that was made by a neuroscientist, which I think is probably quite important, is that wouldn't expect AI or something you might call AI to really be at the point to know about this if they didn't have sensory input. It would part of essential part of our consciousness is being able to sense the
Yes.
world around us, not
Mm.
just read about it. And that's probably, I think, a true statement that's probably
Yes,
an essential part.
that's right. That's why Kurzweil and his ilk imagining us being downloaded into a machine. I mean, it wouldn't really be us in any important sense, in a way.
Yeah, I exactly. I think we're certainly in agreement there, and I think that we are in agreement. However, um, we're also in agreement of something that you've written about, and I have too, which is that as whatever it is, it's the best way. It's the best stuff to send into space, much better than human beings.
Oh yeah, yes, yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and
It says always there, but it can do, and but also it can help us in science. I mean, we know it can play
much more.
games, chess and go, but it could do protein folding, as we know already. And I don't know if you agree, but I think it quite on the cards that it may tell us whether some version of string theory is correct,
Oh,
because
I'm not
the
sure. Yeah, sure. Not maybe string theory, but certainly Feynman's goal of understanding the quantum world by using quantum computers when he proposed them is
yes, yes.
I think absolute. In fact, I'm going to have a long conversation with another
Mhm.
podcast next that I'm recording with my colleague, my former colleague when I was at Harvard, and friend John Preskill, who
Oh yes,
who,
yeah.
and we'll talk about that. But I'm not sure string theory so much, maybe,
Yes, yes.
but understanding how to literally understand quantum systems, which is something we'll literally never be able to do without them at some level, is a
Mhm.
definite potential use of quantum computers. Absolutely.
But I wasn't thinking of the quantum computer. I was just
Uh, uh,
thinking that the manipulation of geometry in
oh,
10 dimensions
oh yeah,
may be
sure.
quite complicated,
Yeah, but
and
I guess I'm a
maybe
yeah. That
classical computers can do it much faster. And then, if it spews out at the end the right mass for the electron and all that, then
yeah,
we know there's something in what it's done,
of
even
course.
though we never have an understanding of it.
Yeah, that's right. That was always the goal of string theory. I still think that's not even going to happen with a computer. What it may be able to tell us is whether it's mathematically consistent. But I guess I'm old-fashioned enough to think that at some point there'll need to be more physical input before it won't be pure mathematics, in my opinion. But we'll see.
Maybe.
I think, and if anything's, this is an aside, but I think you would probably agree with me. If anything, the more we learn about string theory, the more we learn that it doesn't pick out a universe that even if we understand it, which is limited, that the direction seems to be that there's nothing that it won't pick out a universe that looks like ours in general, even if it could. That
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Any case, one of the things that you say actually when you talk about risks in general, before I leave AI, is the statement that uh, let's see. Uh, Oh, here we go. That cyber experts furthering the beneficent use of AI should avoid scenarios where there seems even a minuscule chance of a machine, quote unquote, taking over. I guess, again, I'm not even as worried about that. I'm not worried about that. We give ourselves over to machines all the time. It's just we're not used to it, and we'll get more used to it and more comfortable. I was in Phoenix where they have a company where you can call it like Uber, where you call a self-driving car, and it took me from one place to another, and I let it. I just gave myself into that. But moreover, there's a long history. I think we just have to get used to it. And I think the earliest example is an elevator, right? I mean, you get in an elevator and you have no control over where you're going. You assume
Right.
that tiny computer. I remember when I was a kid, I built a little computer set and showed me how an elevator was a tiny computer. It knows that it's going to take you to floor number 3 when you ask for it, but you don't have any control over it. It doesn't bother
Yeah.
you though, does it? And I think we'll just get used to it, letting
Yes.
computers take over more and more and
Yes.
certain tasks. And so I don't see it's always a danger in that regard, I guess.
Well, I mean, let me say I'm not an expert at all on this subject,
Yeah.
but it's not crazy, is it, to imagine that it could um, have an influence on the world stock markets,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
and, and cause some catastrophe to the financial system,
Yeah,
because
but
that's
I think as that quote said, I guess I'm at least as worried about natural stupidity as I am about artificial
yeah,
intelligence, because humans have had done a pretty good job of producing stock market
yeah,
disasters and housing bubbles and other
yeah,
things. So yeah, it could happen, just like a self-driving car could have an accident,
yeah,
but that's a risk we take. I don't think that's a unique risk necessarily of AI, in my opinion. Anyway, I guess I'm more blasé about it than some people.
yeah,
The you know the example I used at the end of my last book, which still resonates with me, is the example of Plato and others who, when written language became available, were worried that storytelling would end with the invention of writing. And it's just a different world. And that doesn't necessarily have to be worse. But you talk about how science, the bulk of the rest of your book is talking about how science can indeed try and ensure that at least the world is as good as it is now, if not better, and how science can help us. And we both agree we're both unabashed evangelists for science and technology. Science has made the world a better place. Um, and and one of the things you emphasize in this regard, which I think is important, is science is valued often most because of technology. But in fact, the scientific ideas themselves are 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 a fundamental triumph of being human. And as you say, quite apart from the impact on our lives, it's also surely a cultural deprivation not to appreciate the panorama offered by modern cosmology or Darwinian evolution. And I tend to think that it's the cultural impact of science on the way we think of ourselves as human beings that is at least as important, if not more important, than the technology that science creates. And people often just forget that aspect of science. And so science is only useful if it produces something.
Well, I mean, I agree with you that speaking as intellectuals, we would think that way. But if you take the average person, um, they may not appreciate very much about the concepts of science, but they certainly know what aspects of their present lives are a consequence of the application of science.
Oh yeah, well, I'm not even sure that's true. I think people don't realize that it's science, that's quantum
No,
mechanics that's operating my iPhone, I wish they did in some sense. But I don't know about that appreciation. It seems to me that you know that at its heart, science is an intellectual activity that's like music and literature
yes,
that that should be celebrated. It happens to have that amazing spin-off of having made our lives better by creating technology.
yes,
But
mhm,
but if you think about what it means to be human, sure, it's nicer to have a modern, more comfortable life and being able to talk to you across the ocean and all the things that but thinking of my own humanity, I think it's been impacted as much by the scientific revolutions the last 500 years as it has by the greatest music and literature. I don't know. What do
yes.
you
Well, I think to realize that the world is understandable and it's not mysterious spirits and all that. So we don't need to worry in the way that people in the pre-scientific era worried about uh, uh, disasters happening. So we understand there's some rationality and repeatability in
Yeah,
nature, which is a feature of science, obviously.
which
And
changed the world. Yeah, is that people, the
that
famous some
produces
historians saying that Newton caused the end of the burning of witches, but I don't know if it's really true,
no,
but
no,
but it
but it
makes
does. It reduces irrational dread.
yeah,
Uh,
it reduces irrational dread, and the other benefit that you point out, which is a sign, which is a technological one, is the more we understand the world, the less bewildering it is, but more amazing it becomes,
yes,
which is
yes,
one aspect. And the second part is the more we're able to change it, which is the other impact of science. Those are really the two huge
yes.
benefits of science, I guess. And although somewhere I was looking in where it is, I don't know if I skipped it or if it's later on. You do point out that someone said there's there's applied science and there's science that's going to become applied or something like that.
Yes,
And I'm
yes.
not sure I don't buy that dichotomy. I mean, I I don't I don't apologize for, nor do I think it's what I fully expect that virtually everything I've ever worked on will never have an application. And that's okay. I mean, I don't think understanding dark matter and galaxies is likely ever to have an application. And of course, the technologies we use to develop experiments to look for it is a different thing. But the concept, we're not going to make dark matter bombs, we're not going to make dark matter cars, and that's okay. And I think there's parts of science that will never be applied, and that's okay. Do you agree?
Oh, yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I quote this was George Porter, who was a chemist, saying
Yeah.
this, and I think he wouldn't disagree with what you're saying. He would just say that, um, as we know very well, it's a long time before there's an application. I mean, I give the example of a laser,
Yeah.
which was developed in the 60s using Einstein's ideas from the 1920s, and many applications of the laser weren't envisaged by the people who invented it. they came much later. So I just meant something like that. That you can never be sure of how science is going to be applied. There's a lot of
Absolutely, and
so,
moreover choosing to, as you talk about later in the book, and we'll get to choose, and something I strongly agree with and have been advocating for a long time is that choosing how to fund science by looking at its applications is often mis
yes.
misdirected as well. And you use one or two examples. The example I always use is computers. If you put a lot of money into building a fast computer before the transistor, you'd have computers with flywheels and other things. The
Mhm.
transistor was invented and not to make better computers necessarily, but
Yeah, yeah.
change the world. And so, yeah, you never know.
Mm,
That's why it's important to fund curiosity-driven research. We'll get there. One of the things you say, which is a beautiful sentence, and I don't know if it's yours, but I don't really care. Science is organized skepticism. I don't know if you got that from someone, but it's a wonderful description of the scientific process because of the way science it works as a dialectic. It works as a you say because the greatest esteem goes to those who contribute something unexpected and original, especially
mm,
those who could overturn a consensus, and therefore, um, therefore, we need to be skeptical of not just existing ideas, but ideas that are proposed.
mm,
Um,
mm.
but I wonder if you've talked. Have you read anything by Jonathan Rauch? He's I had a podcast with him. He's a journalist and a writer. He's written several books about science that have enlightened me about science. And what he makes a point of is that science is inherently a social activity. It's not. He's
Mm,
not one of these new age, one of these deconstructionists. That science is socially derived. I mean, the electron mass is with the electron mass. But he
mm.
argues that it cannot be done without this, without a community, because
Right.
it's required that all ideas are immediately open to attack, if you want to call it, or skepticism and discussion, and that's the only way science can progress as as a social activity.
Mhm, mhm.
Do you? Would you buy? I
No,
mean, I
I
think.
agree with that. Yes, yes. I mean, so sometimes you want to think in a solitary way for quite a long time, but the validation comes from interaction with your peers.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Exactly. We want to. There is time for thinking, and it's an important thing to do. But without, but it could not proceed by a group of people thinking and not, and we've seen the dangers of people thinking on their own. With well, you talked about it, even the great scientists like Hoyle and others become
Mhm.
obsessed with an idea
Yes.
and not and the community moves on because the community sort of it's not so it's science as the enterprise moves on only because of the community of people who are constantly questioning and testing and speaking out about other people's view ideas. Anyway, it's a he's an interesting it's an interesting read. When I after this is over, I'll send you the book,
Yeah, please do.
the name of the book, because um, I thought, I was surprised that I learned something about um, uh, uh, um, the nature of science by a non-scientist, and he's definitely a non-scientist, but it's very
Mhm.
interesting. Um, you talk about the goals of science being modest, and I think that's another important thing. You say if you ask scientists themselves what they're working on, you'll seldom get an inspirational reply like seeking to cure cancer or understanding the universe. Rather, they will focus on a tiny piece of the puzzle and tackle something that seems tractable. And I think that's a really important aspect of science that people don't realize, that they think it's always aimed, and all scientists are doing grand things when it works by baby steps. And again, I think that's probably once again one of the hardest things. I don't know if you found it in your graduate students. I found it myself as a graduate student. I have found it in training graduate students is to say, you're biting off more than you can chew. Just try and pick a problem you can actually solve.
Yes, yes, yes. But of course, you've got to find a problem which is going to be relevant to a big picture.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
lots of small problems are not worth doing because
Yeah,
they don't have any impact. But the judgment comes in when you decide to pick a bite-sized problem which you can make progress, and don't bang your head against the wall because it's too hard. But a problem which is going to be part of the big picture. And I also say in my book that one of the reasons it's important to interact with the wider public is that otherwise we get blinkered and we forget that what we're doing is only worthwhile in the long run if it does help to illuminate a big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important to get that feedback and to understand at the same time that what you and I do is both a luxury and it's supported by the public and therefore we shouldn't be surprised. It's our own fault if they're not interested in what, in some sense, it's their own fault if it's, or at least it's their right, but also their own fault if we think something's important but the public doesn't. It's
Mm.
probably our fault for not communicating why as very effectively.
Yes.
Nor should we expect to be funded just because we think it's interesting or we like it.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, and
Well, there's also the familiar story of Penges and Wilson, when Wilson, he was so focused on clearing out the pigeon shit from the equipment and all that stuff that he didn't realize how important his discovery was until he read Walter Sullivan in the New York Times,
yeah, that's right, exactly. You talk about that in your book, absolutely.
referring to
Eh,
the afterglow of creation. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And
So that's
I
why he
found
talks
the
about.
same thing. Well, I've written a lot of books, and so have you. And I found when writing books about, especially about subjects that I think I understand very well,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I try and tackle a broader area so I can learn it. Well, that's why I write books often. But in trying to communicate it, I suddenly have a totally different perspective of both its importance and what the key ideas are. In the effort of popularization, I learn a lot. You too?
Yes. Yes. Hmm.
Yeah, I know you say that you personally um, would be very feel very unfulfilled if you didn't have the opportunity to explain what you were working on to a wider public. I don't think that's I feel the same way. I don't think it's required though. I mean,
No, no. Mm.
there are plenty of scientists who are quite happy not, and
They must
I
talk to their colleagues, as you say, but
yeah.
that's all right.
Yeah, they're not. And one of the things that worried me, and when we talk about public funding, which is an aside I hadn't thought about before, but mentioning here, but certainly it's something that used to worry me, was when the various funding agencies would require young scientists who were um, applying for these very prestigious fellowships or grants, like the Outstanding Junior Investigator Grant. And I was a chairman of the department, and these kids would come up to me, and I'd say kids because they were young. Um, and they had what was required was they had to have a public outreach component of their
Mm.
research. Most of them had never had either been postdocs working actively or graduate students, never even taught, much less had it. And they had to invent some public outreach based on no experience and often no interest.
Yeah.
And and I thought how sad that was because most of them never, even when they got those awards, most of the public outreach never went anywhere. But I think the point is that we should encourage those scientists who have an interest to do it, but not require all scientists to do it.
No, absolutely. And some don't like it and no good at it. But I think on the other hand, I think those scientists in academia who do this sort of thing ought to get some credit. I mean,
Oh yeah,
it shouldn't be that the only thing that counts for promotion is publication in referee journals. Writing good blogs and interacting with the public in other ways is very important in keeping the scientific community healthy.
it
And
certainly is
also,
public service, and often service to the community is one of the things that leads to tenure. And that I agree with you. I'm obviously a son who one person who spent a lot of time doing it, and more, and but just not everyone. And as I often like to say, not only do I think all scientists should communicate with the public, there's some of my colleagues who I definitely don't want to interact with the public, and
yes,
and but the ultimate point is that when it comes to the importance of communicating with the public and also the importance of sort of pure versus applied science, you say this is why much of science is best funded as a public good.
yes,
Ultimately, we think the process of science is a public good and therefore should be funded. And that's independent of necessarily the technical applications, the consequences, but the whole process of trying to ask questions about the world is a good thing.
Yes, yes, because you can't predict what will be applied and when. And if you look back at the antecedents of some important discovery or some important invention, then of course it's lots of different people who've contributed different ways. So it's very hard to isolate the credit. But I think all we can say is that overall, in a broad brush sense, the amount spent on pure research has more than justified itself.
Yeah, no, and I remember at the time it was during, I guess, the Bush administration when I was arguing that and there was a group that produced a very important report on pointing out that you could argue that half of the U.S. gross domestic product was due to funding curiosity-driven research 25 to 50 years beforehand, rather than applied research. And there is a great motivation to focus in funding agencies on purely applied, but you just don't know. And if you stop the curiosity-driven research, you're ultimately hiring, even if you're interested primarily in the economic benefits.
Yes,
And
yes. But you do have to consider trying to optimize economic benefits, and certainly in my country, there's a problem getting the first stage to commercialization. You know, you go to
mhm.
get it to lab to a prototype. You need some venture capital, and that's hard to come by. So one needs to ease that path, but that's not a reason for downgrading the importance of funding the basic science. And of course, the other point I would make is that insofar as the basic science is done in universities, then it's done by the same people who are going to have another important output, namely bright and well-trained students.
Yeah,
And all these
absolutely.
things are working together.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, training the students is maybe it's understanding the fact that the students we're training, both as undergraduates and graduate students, we're not trying to create clones of ourselves. That
Mm, mm,
that it is right and fair that most of our students don't become academics.
mm,
It would almost be a shame if they did,
mm,
because
mm,
the training we give them will then go out and they'll maybe they'll create Google or something like that, which will whether for better or worse will change the economic perspective of the world. Or and so we I remember in thinking about how to teach physics. One of the problems of the way we taught it, it was a revelation for me when a colleague of mine, a former colleague at Harvard, pointed out to me that we shouldn't, when we're teaching students, they don't need to have all the set of skills that a functioning physicist does. And therefore, it's okay to recognize that we're not trying to create clones of ourselves, and to change the way we teach a little bit so that they may not have all the technical expertise to calculate everything about a brick sliding down a inclined plane, but maybe they don't need to.
no, no, no. But I think we do need to ensure that academia attracts enough people to keep it going
Y-
and sustain it. Because um, one point which I mentioned in my book is that I think academic careers, certainly in your country and mine, are becoming less attractive than they were.
Yes. Yeah,
Mm,
absolutely. And
because
trying to make sure that, and there are a bunch of reasons, and one that you don't talk about. I do want to get to this area which you don't talk much about, because I think maybe you don't have an experience so much, is one of the reasons. There are a number of reasons why I think academia is becoming less attractive to people. And I am concerned about, as you know, because I've written about this. You talk about the pressures and difficulty of academia, and not just publishing, but
the order of culture generally. Yeah.
yeah, but one of the things that caused the problem, I'll just bring it up, and because I want to focus on again later when when it's made relevant, is you say one of the um uh what's crucial in sifting error and validating scientific claims is open discussion.
Mm,
And
yeah.
I do think, and I'll make this statement now. You can comment on it if you want, but I want to discuss it more with you. That one of the things that is making an academic career less attractive to a lot of people is the fact that open discussion is becoming more difficult in academic institutions,
Yeah.
and
Mm,
people are afraid of that, and that's making the environment less pleasant for a lot of
yes.
people.
Mhm,
And
yes.
I don't know if you've experienced it in the wonderful
Mm,
places you work,
mhm,
but it's happening around the world.
mhm,
Um, uh, the the imperative to foster, you say the imperative to foster openness and debate is a common thread through all the examples I've discussed. Um, and and that imperative to foster openness and debate, how do you view, you talk about the importance of communicating to the public through social media, but what do you think about social media and its fostering of openness and debate?
Uh, well, I mean, I think it's got very severe downsides, but more broadly in politics, because I think uh, it's not just Trump; it's the advent of social media
Yeah,
uh, follows out the moderate centre and gives voice to the extremes. Um, in contrast to when we had our news mainly through regular newspapers, etc., when responsible journalists would sort of muffle the crazy extremes.
yeah,
The news are muffled, and you click on them and get something still more extreme. And this, I think, is a structural problem which is going to affect democracy in general. It happens obviously within more specialized social groups, including academia as well.
yeah, yeah. Well,
But although I don't think in academia, we know there are cranks of all kinds, and we just learn to discount them.
well, it'd be great. Yeah, it would be great. But I don't think we're. Yeah, well, I think unfortunately the cranks are being. Sometimes the cracks are really fascinating and interesting people that push the
Yeah.
field forward, and we deal with that when they're making a valuable contribution. And unfortunately, I think we're finding that the interesting cranks. I mean, I'm virtually certain that Newton would not be allowed to have an academic position today, if he were living in the modern world, and it would be a loss for humanity in that case.
Well, I mean, I think uh, one point I make is that because academia is getting less attractive, there's much slower promotion for
Hmm.
these demographic reasons. There's no longer an expansion of higher education in the way there was when we were young, and people don't retire, so they occupy positions for even longer. And so this therefore means that it takes longer to establish yourself. And I quote the NIH, where the average age where you get your first grant has now risen to like 43.
Yeah, it's
Um,
amazing.
whereas, and we want to have in academia not just the people who can't do anything else, but people of versatile talent and ambition who want to feel they've done something distinctive and original in their 30s. And if that doesn't remain possible in academia, then we lose many of the people we want to keep, because we want a lot of them to go in and start companies, etc. But
Yeah.
we want some to stay in academia.
Yeah,
And
and as you point out again, to jump ahead, that's true not just for academics. You want people who have done 2 years of university, but then find that they can go on not to feel like failures, but to say, I took 2 good years of, I got two good years of education, and we should celebrate that. And I think it's, yeah, I mean, the situation in academia is becoming more and more difficult for a lot of reasons. But before we get there, I really want to talk about, you do point, you say something that I think is really relevant. I want to talk about this relationship between science and government that you've spent a lot of time on and that you focus on in the book, in part of the book. There's a wonderful sentence that said, "There's no reason to expect scientific issues to be straightforward, even if they refer to something everyday and familiar." And I think, um, I I learned. I guess this first became clearer to me with my wife, who my wife worked for the government of Australia as sort of science management for the government. And what she made me realize, and I thought I'd understood this already, but quite clearly, is that what scientists don't understand what's important often, don't understand what's important, well, the questions that are important to politicians, and politicians don't understand the questions that are important to scientists. And that if we worked harder so that each group could understand what the other's priorities were involved in and why they were, it would be really a great assistance to the way science can do what you want to do, which is help us save the world. And that, go on. You were going to say something.
But of course, one point I make is that a bigger fraction of the kind of decisions which politicians have to take do have a scientific element to them.
Yeah,
Um,
more and more. In fact,
whether
science has become, yeah.
health, environment, energy,
It's hard to imagine actually almost any. I've argued it's hard to imagine any significant political question, especially at national level, that doesn't have a scientific component at this
No,
point.
that's right.
And the stakes are getting larger in many ways, and so the need for that sound making public policy based in the first sense on empirical evidence on the one hand, and the need for scientists to be able to communicate to politicians recognizing the limitations of their own knowledge and abilities is that combination is more urgent than ever.
Yeah. Mhm.
And I think you give an example. Even when scientific facts are agreed upon, the planned response depends on balancing the ethics, economics, and politics. That's what scientists understand. They say, scientists, look, and the example you give is a good one. The consensus isn't easy to reach among experts. For example, shutting schools down may reduce the spread of infections. So scientists would say, we want to solve the pandemic, we shut schools down. It's
Mhm.
obvious. But of
Mhm.
course, as you then say, but might not this benefit be outweighed by the harm done by disrupting children's education, which is,
Yeah.
of course, a big issue on the right now
Yeah.
in the U.S. And especially those disadvantaged children whose parents couldn't offer effective homeschooling. But that's an issue. So often the scientists, well, it's obvious what the right thing to do is. Or look, take climate change. It's obvious we need to do this. But then the politician will say, well, first of all, I have a public I have to deal with that may not accept not eating as much meat or whatever you want to pick. And I
Mhm.
have economic questions. And so while the scientific risk is clear, the way to mediate it is not so clear because there those ethics, economics, and politics are not illusory. They're real. Scientists may think they're illusory, but they're real in the real world.
No, I mean, I think most scientists, unless they're really very blinkered, they're aware of issues. They're aware that there's ethics and economics.
Yeah,
The point is that they only deserve special attention,
yeah.
the scientific part of the decision. Obviously, they're citizens, and they should care about all the other aspects in the same way. But in those respects, they are just citizens, and they can offer advice, but not with the expectation of any special weight.
That's right. Well, they should offer advice. They've scientific expertise, right, but not policy advice without understanding. And I think the problem is that scientists tend to dismiss, say, "Oh, your concerns, as a politician, are irrelevant." And of course, then they lose. If your interest is communication, then
They're very
you can't
naive, but I hope they're not all like that.
well, but at the same time, unfortunately, it goes the other way. There are politicians who are saying you scientists are pie in the sky people that don't understand how the real
Yeah,
world works, and
yeah.
that those two things are the biggest obstacles to having science do what you and I would like it to do.
Mhm.
Now, there's another aspect that you talk about, which is interesting, which is science advisors, and you do
Mhm.
point out a difference between Britain and I know Australia. I'm not sure of Canada actually. The science advisors are public servants, are civil servants in some sense, and they're not political appointees
Mhm.
in the UK, and I know in Australia. Whereas the United States always has this, well, not always, but in the last 60 years has had, with a few exceptions, has had presidents choose uh, science advisors, and in the most recent case had a cabinet appointment, and therefore were political advisors. In this case, we're subject to the vicissitudes of politics, like
Mhm.
Eric Lander. Um, and you argue that it's probably better to have a system where scientists who are giving advice are not political appointees.
Um, yes, well, of course, it's not quite a clear-cut distinction because certainly in Britain, each minister has his political advisors,
Yeah,
etc.,
yeah, yeah.
and there are some permanent people working in the government, in NSF and places like that. But there is a tendency for more of a revolving door in the US than in the UK, and uh, this this means that you don't have such high chance of getting long-term continuity. Um, but on the other hand, as I discussed in the context of defence, um, uh, your system means that there are some people with real expertise who are outside the system. In the UK, working for the Ministry of Defence is a rather closed world. And that therefore means that there aren't people outside that system who criticize it with a level
With
of
no,
expertise that's needed.
yeah.
So that's
Would it seems to me the best? I was as I was thinking about what you said. The best compromise is to have um, scientists appointed to advise the government, but with fixed terms, so
yes,
that
yes,
you know you have a 5-year term and you have it no matter what.
yes,
I mean,
yes,
unless barring
yes,
major problems, but and then there are new people because you want constantly you don't you want to have new scientists involved,
yes,
and but you're not subject to the election cycle or whatever, and you can give advice and then move on and then move back into academia, as you say, and or elsewhere, and then have that expertise based on that 5-year term or 10-year term, which is then valued by the academic environment as well.
I mean, yeah, that's right. I mean, there was in the UK system, there are some people who are civil servants for their lifetime, whereas the senior ones, there's a chief scientific advisor in every department of the
Mhm.
government who is seconded from a university.
Okay, and
Or
so they do have a term appointment basically, and the university guarantees them a job when they come back, and and that sort of thing. That seems to me, I agree. I mean, that's what happens. The presidential science advisor in principle. I've had several departments I've been in where the person's become the presidential science advisor. Usually, you're not allowed to leave. They used to not allowed to take a leave more than 2 years with the university, but they tend to say if you're advising the president, you're allowed more longer term. And and you can get excellent people. And when they are excellent and not political, like Ernie Moniz and Steve Chu, uh, have a significant role, and it's kind of. But I guess I just want to ask this question. Eric Lander, you point out, is a brilliant scientist and brought great expertise and utility. Um, do you think the fact that some people think he was a bully should have been a reason to remove him? I don't, myself.
well, I just don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
if it was very bad, yes. If it wasn't too bad, no. So I just don't
Okay.
know the facts.
Well, he'd been fairly successful in working with people most of his career, and producing results, and so um,
Mm.
I understand. I guess he didn't suffer fools gladly, but that's not a reason. It's in academia you're allowed to do that more effectively than in politics, I think,
Well,
and
but there is a difference because the junior people can't answer back in government, whereas in academia it's more sort of democratic, not
well,
so.
one would hope. Yeah, 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 and okay. Now let me. I just you spend time. I know that personally, you and I have talked about Joseph Rotblat. You're the first person actually who I think I really learned about Joseph Rotblat from years ago. So you admire him. He's one of your idols, I think, scientific idols. Is that a true statement or?
Well,
Um,
I think I do admire his lifelong commitments,
mm,
and he was lucky to live to be 95 and still to be an inspiring speaker, even to a group of students in his 90s. So he had a long-term influence. But I think the reason I got involved to some extent with Pugwash in the 1980s was that I admired him, and also I got to know Rudy Piles, for
yeah,
instance,
yeah,
the idea for the bomb, and in the US, people like John Simpson and Hans Bethe, who I
yeah,
got to know academically. And I just felt that when that great generation were no longer around, it'd be a pity if there weren't committed people who couldn't match their expertise or
yeah,
credibility, but who were uh, trying to campaign along the lines that they would have appreciated. And so, I mean, Rotblat was the prime example of this, given his entire life history. But um, I would say similar things about Piles and Hans Bethe.
yeah.
And
And maybe and Dick
the,
Garwin or no or
the guy, but the guy was slightly. He was
more
too young to be
professional.
in.
Mhm.
Yeah, Dick Garvin. I think his career is wonderful. He's still going strong in his 90s.
Yeah,
But he was he was too young to actually be in World War II, I think.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Now, but well, so the one thing that you pointed out that about particularly unique and something you admired about Rotblat, which I think is worth mentioning, is that he was the only person to leave the Manhattan Project once he felt that there was the moral imperative was the concern that Adolf Hitler would develop a nuclear weapon. And then when it was clear that that wasn't the case, he left. He left. He heard that and apparently he left when he heard that I think General Groves probably say, "Well, we can use it against Russia," and he was the only one that everyone else, as Feynman often talks about, the seduction of the advance became so.
Free technology, yes.
Yeah. I mean, it became that's quite. Oh, we can do it. We can do it. That overrode the moral issue, the ethical issue.
No, I think that's true. I mean, it was obviously more complicated in regards to motivation because his wife, who he'd never seen since he left Poland at the outbreak of war, went to England, and he was desperate to find out was she still alive, etc. So he had other reasons for perhaps trying to get back to Europe, but there's no doubt that he was only doing this nuclear research at all because he wanted to beat the Nazis.
Okay, but now I want to say once again how the best intentions can go awry. I think you suggested he was the one that suggested that scientists should take a kind of Hippocratic oath, not to cause harm. I think that has the greatest potential for disaster of anything. And the example I'm going to give you, and I want to see what you think about, it ultimately stifles research. And the example I know of now that I just wrote about was, I think, one of the Nature journals that said that they will not publish material that might possibly not physically harm, but emotionally harm marginalized groups. So they wouldn't. Nature Behavior, I think, was the journal that said that basically, if some group could take the results of that research and find it offensive or hurt them, that they would not publish the results. And so it seems to me, if you take if we start requiring scientists to do no harm, the question is who decides what the harm is, and that's my real concern. And so I want to ask you to comment on that.
First of all, I mean, I don't think that issue you've raised would come under Hippocratic oath at all, really. But I share your skepticism because the main point is one can't predict what the implications of one's work are going to be. And therefore, unless you're really sure it'll have no benefits, then it's best to proceed cautiously. So I'm not sure much will be added by
that's it's true that we don't know what the benefits are, and we've already discussed that. And that's a great part. But it seems to me, if we start saying scientists do no harm, then we automatically give someone else the right to decide what harm is, and that is as equally, I would argue, subjective in some ways as the ethical, political, and economic issues you talked about earlier. And we see people saying, when it comes to physics, that it's harmful to have whiteboards. I mean, there's an article that just came out of Physical Review. I mean, because that's racist, and it's obviously ridiculous. But when we start, immediately once you start giving these requirements, or I think it was Nature. You cannot. Was Royal Society of Chemistry gave a admonition to its editors not to allow anything that could be offensive to anyone on the basis of almost anything. They gave a list of 25 different requirements, and there's almost nothing you can say at some level that doesn't offend someone. And if you use that as a constraint, then it seems to me you stifle that whole thing that we talked about earlier, which is that science thrives and actually only succeeds with free and open debate.
Yes, well, I mean, first of all, I don't think those who supported Joe and the Hippocratic Oath would have disagreed with you particularly on this, because they were thinking of substantial harm, like bioweapons and things like that. But on the issue you're raising, which is a problem, this is really the view that people don't have a right to be people have a right not to be offended.
Yeah. And people have no such right. You agree?
Yes, that is pernicious. And in fact, in my university, there was a a proposed document that said that one should respect alternative views. And there was an amendment proposed to replace the word respect by tolerate.
Okay,
The
yeah.
vote that won by 90% to 10%.
Yeah, I think the point is, and I've said this many
And it
times,
was the
it's
right
one can respect individuals, but one doesn't have to respect ideas.
That's right.
And I think
Yes,
that's
I
a
think
fundamental difference.
it was the right thing that you should you and you should tolerate other opinions, but you
Yeah.
don't need to respect other
And
opinions.
yeah. In fact, ridiculing them is sometimes the best thing you can do. Sometimes. I know you never do, but sometimes it's worth ridiculing. And and having said that about the Hippocratic Oath, you reminded me that when I taught at Yale, I was involved at a time getting my faculty colleagues to agree not to sign a statement saying they wouldn't work on Star Wars research, for example, the Reagan Star Wars thing. They would not take federal money to work on that program, which was a clearly harmful thing. So I guess in certain instances, I think it's okay to to make those
Yeah,
kind of take those kind of oaths.
yeah,
Um,
that's
but
reasonable. Mm.
you praised Jason, this group that was founded of scientists that advise the Pentagon on, and I know we both know a number of colleagues who we admire tremendously, including Freeman Dyson and even Steve Weinberg and others. So Steve left after a while. Um, but the one thing that I'm not sure it's as universally good as you suggest. Namely, it seemed to me that the difference was that the people who chose the questions they were going to work on was they were often directed by the military. And therefore, the key ethical questions never got asked. I think, for example, during the Vietnam War, they investigated whether there should be an electronic fence across Vietnam. That's a technical issue, but clearly the ethical question was begged, and therefore it is worrisome when there are groups that do advise military, but the questions are provided by the military rather than by the scientists themselves. So that's why I've always had problems with Jason. So I wanted to get your sense of that.
Well, I mean, I share your concerns. I mean, I think the reason I mentioned Jason was it has the characteristics that it involves top-rate scientists
Yeah,
in
and
more
they
than
were
just
top rate.
sitting around a table for a day and minutes being taken, but in getting together and coming up with new ideas, tossing ideas off each other, and that's because they know and respect each other, and they choose their own membership, etc., and they know they're listened to. Uh, and I think that those are prerequisites for it working. And I've several times talked to people over here about whether we could replicate that sociology, as it were, in the UK. And I certainly think we never could in the defence area. Um, Partly because people are slightly less robust in their views, but more important, we in the UK can't make any very important independent decisions. So they wouldn't think they work on important problems. But on the other hand, I think it is worth trying to replicate the sociology in something like an integrated transport system for cities or something of that kind. You know, where the social benefits and it has a lot of technology involved and cross-disciplinarity. So
Um,
I do think it would be worthwhile in the UK trying this system. I mean,
yeah,
there are lots of committees of all kinds
yeah,
that advise
but where people substantively spend time working.
get people together for 6 weeks to think through a problem and try to be original. That's something which has been tried, and I just thought it would be worth trying, but it would not be worth trying in the defence area.
Yeah, but the problem, I agree. It's a wonderful opportunity for fruitful discovery and interaction. But I guess I'd say the reason it only works in the defense area, in at least the reason Jason functioned, is that General Dynamics or military contractors who paid for it make so much money that they could afford to make it financially and intellectually attractive to those people working on Jason. I suspect in other areas, unless you found a government that was willing or a private company that was willing to fund that kind of activity, it'd be hard to make it happen.
Well, I
It's
think,
easier defense because there's a lot of money involved.
yeah, yeah. But, so I'm saying that if it is in England, we should get the Ministry of Transport or something to do
Yeah.
it.
Well,
But
or maybe a private company, maybe
I
Tesla
think
or
I'm
something.
right in saying that Steve Koonin, who
Uh-huh.
was, I think, deputy head of the Jason Group,
Yeah,
and then he went to work as chief scientist for BP.
yeah, yeah, he did.
In that latter capacity, he did organise a sort of mini Jason type activity on energy, which
Yeah.
took place in Santa Barbara, I think. So he made a. I don't know how successful it was, but he tried to do something in that sort of spirit.
Yeah, no, in
Uh,
Aspen, and the Aspen Center for Physics, once Steve and other people, and Steve
yeah.
Chu, yeah, ran a. I was there for that, and yeah, no, that's good. And the question, of course, and this is leads naturally to the next question. You point out that in the U.S., because of this sort of revolving door, in defense, we have a lot of experts, people who know what they're talking about, who aren't required by secrecy arguments to not talk about it, and that's a good thing. But let me ask a devil's advocate kind of question again, because both you and I were involved in the Bolton the Atomic Scientists. What got me, all my the people, many of the people I admired when I was in graduate school were deeply involved in the Bolton the Atomic Scientists, and that's why one of the reasons I got involved. The notion that scientists would speak out and try and inform the public about the dangers of something that was very dangerous
Mhm.
seemed to me incredibly important. And as I say, in my case, the people I admired were involved. And then I was immensely honored to become not only on the board of sponsors, but the chair of the board of sponsors. And I was very active for a decade in that. But
Mhm.
uh, and reminded me of how I would have felt, how happy I was to be in a position that I guess I would have admired a lot when I was younger. But then to be fairer, I'd have to ask as a devil's advocate, did it really ever have any impact? And I'm not sure. You gave one example. I think from your own experience of in a defense case when you were on I think in the House of Lords or in a where made a suggestion, but eventually the government never took up on it. And I'm not sure I think the Bolton is a good thing. I always think information is a good thing, but I don't really know if it ever has an impact. I'm not sure. You argue that Rotblat's Pugwash conferences did allow a back channel of discussion, but it's great to have it. But I'm not. I don't. I'm sad to say I'm not sure any of this has had as much of an impact as we'd like.
Well, I mean, I think two things. First, uh, uh, in the Cold War, when there was very little other contact between
Mm.
East and West,
Uh-huh.
then there was a back channel via the Pugwash conferences,
Yeah.
which was, and similarly, the National Academy and the Russian Academy, the National Academy committee being chaired by Panofsky,
Uh-huh.
and people like people like that. They and Darwin was involved. They had an effect, but of course, when things opened up, then there were far more uh, activities like that, and it's harder for any single one to have an effect when there are
Yeah.
official channels. And I think one thing I mentioned I was involved in was something run by a think tank on whether the UK should keep the Trident missile system.
Yes, that's it.
And, this well, this was only a UK venture, and it
Yeah.
was simply on the policy question, and it wrote a report which um, it had no effects. But on the other hand, it's a sort of thing that might have had an effect if this was an open issue. In fact, there was a decision that had been made a few years ago, and they weren't going to overturn it without a very strong reason, and so it didn't have very much effect. But I think the main point is that now there are far more ways in which this debate takes place in the media, etc., and op-eds in the major
Yeah.
newspapers have an effect, uh, and what individual politicians say have an effect. So that's why uh, no single small group can have as much effect as it did
As it.
during the Cold War, when there was only one such group,
Yeah.
and it was the only way you could actually exchange information. So I think Pogwas did have an effect in the 1960s, but much less since then.
Much less since then. But now, I guess to me, it seemed. Let me. Well, you had this experience, and I'm going to make. When I look at everything from the national academies to bulletin, it seems to me, and the example you gave just reinforces my maybe prejudice, but I think it's based on observation. What happens is when groups of scientists advise the government in these regards, if the advice agrees with what the government thinks is politically expedient, they take it, and they completely ignore it otherwise. And so all it does is, all of these studies and reports end up not changing policy. They just, if they happen to if they happen to agree with the policy the government was intending to do, they're enacted, and it looks like they have an impact. But if they're politically inexpedient, they're just ignored. And I tend to think that's the way it works. But please tell me I'm wrong.
Well, two things. First, in defence, the sort of issues like whether the UK should keep Trident, that's not a scientific issue primarily. It is a political issue. So
Yeah, yeah.
you can't expect a scientific committee to have much say. And in fact, the committee on Trident, it wasn't a scientific committee. It was a committee of politicians, etc.
Yeah,
And the
you were one of the
general.
few scientists on it.
Um, so, but I think that there are different issues where international meetings of scientists are important. And to take one example, after the gain of function experiments in microbiology, then there was a genuine issue about whether government should fund that sort of experiments
Mm-hmm.
and whether journals should publish the papers. And there was a meeting convened by the National Academy and some other foreign academies, including ours, uh, to where they got an international group of scientists and the editors of Nature and one or two other
Yeah.
journals to discuss policy on this question. And I think that's a case when the views of that group would have been taken seriously, because it's a matter where science is important and the scientific community's views are important.
Well, interesting because I think, look, anytime there's good international discussions, it's a good thing. But I'm going to push back a little bit because I think you argued that. I mean, I would argue when it comes to gain of function issues, the chief thing that caused at least movement in that regard was when journalists or other people wrote about that. Not so much scientists discussing it, but when books were written and there were stories and the public got interested and
Yes.
concerned, and and I think that moved things towards having such a meeting rather than the other way around. And
No,
so
yeah,
it was.
no, I agree it did, but I think the views expressed at a meeting, which was international, contained a lot, most of the experts, those views would be given weight by government.
Oh yeah, I think so. But I agree. But I think that's probably um, because the government doesn't have a dog in that fight. I mean, in the sense that
Right.
yeah, if there was some overriding reason why the government thought a gain of function would work, then it wouldn't. Then they wouldn't. I mean, it was useful for political or defense reasons or some other things. And my suspicion is that they go ahead anyway. But maybe I'm
Yes,
wrong.
precisely, and understandably. Because my whole point is that the scientists only have the right to be heard specially on the scientific issues,
Sure.
and they may well be overridden by political
Yeah,
concerns.
yeah. Well, okay, and yeah, and well, and in general they should, but they often are. I guess I was going to ask you. Well, let me ask you now. I mean, you've talked about the difference between the Royal Society, which you have an intimate knowledge of, because you're the president of it, and many years as a fellow, and many committees before, during, and after, and the National Academies. When I think I suspect you're probably a foreign member of the National Academy. I figured you were, but
Mhm.
the difference, I guess, again, with a jaded view, I don't see the National Academy as being particularly important or useful. It primarily, most of its purpose is spent on choosing members, and most of its energy is spent on choosing members. And while it convenes useful groups that do produce documents, sometimes I've utilized, that they're ignored if unless they're expedient. And for the most part, I suspect if the National Academy didn't exist, you could create, as you argue, could you create groups? The question you ask in your book is, could one create groups that weren't uh, that would effectively do the same thing? And you've argued that, in your opinion, the Royal Society does deserve to exist because it
Well,
does have added value. But I'm just wondering about the National Academy because I think the National
no,
Academy is
no,
increasingly
well,
irrelevant.
two separate things. I mean, I think the Royal Society and National Academy are similar. The slight difference is that formally the National Academy uh, can be instructed to give advice to the government. It's less independent of the government than the Royal Society is. And that actually was quite a sharp issue when there was a report on climate change produced in about 2003, when Bruce Alberts wouldn't agree to what Rob May wanted at the time. So that was when there was a difference, which meant that the National Academy had to be more cautious. But again, there's not very much difference. And I agree. I don't think these academies have a huge influence, but I think that in the example I quoted, like, uh, are there some kind of biomedical experiments which are so dangerous they shouldn't be done at all or shouldn't be published? I think it's very good to have a body which is accepted to be representative of top scientists and which can express a view. And I think it has done some good things in that area, and even in climate change. And the first serious report on geoengineering was done by the Royal Society in 2009. And the guy came and gave evidence to a congressional committee over here, over in the US, and etc. So it does some things, but I agree with you. But the other thing you quoted is that uh, there is too much emphasis on getting people elected and all that, and the fact it's honorific does lead to this. And I did say that the minimum criterion for an academy to be credible is that it's not possible to construct a better virtual academy from non-members who are eligible. And
Yes, exactly. It was brilliant. And I guess my answer for the National Academy is it's not clear to me. I can't speak. I'm sure the Royal Academy Society is better, but
well, no,
it's
it's again not completely clear, and that's why I think if one has these things, one should not uh, attach too much weight to honorific membership.
yeah. So I mean, it's the
Because
honorific
it's
thing
all
that turned
rubbish.
people off, like Feynman, another scientist I know, Yorkin, who was a member but never agreed to go because, yeah. And then what do you think? I wasn't going to ask, but what the heck? Because I've written about it. What I've written about the National Academy recently, which has become more and more politically correct in the last bunch of years as they become more, like many scientific institutions, more susceptible or more alert to social media concerns and possible negative publicity. And the National Academies just last year were there was an article in Science about how there was 50% female because they specifically um, stopped giving people ability to make appointments if they were appointing males, and more
Mm.
or less. I mean, and what do you think of that?
Um, well, I mean, up to a point, I think it's sensible because clearly women have had a tough time in the past.
Yeah, in the past,
A
I agree.
60-year-old woman uh, will have had a difficult early career because of
Absolutely.
the way things
Oh,
were then.
but what do you
And
think? But when it comes to making it appointments, like basing it on that, um, don't you think that ultimately um, demeans the credibility of a body that uh, uh, looking to make more diverse appointments is one thing, but having a
yes,
rule that there has to be that ultimately committees will get appointments that will the number of people they'll be able to appoint will be based on their past um, behavior in appointing people that are
mm,
acceptable to the directors of the academy.
yes, yes. Well, I mean, if it goes too far, I agree it would be a mistake. But on the other hand, what they're doing, I think is fair. I mean, I guess you've been head of the department in a university,
Yeah.
and I would have thought that in considering appointments of the senior positions, then it's appropriate, in the case of a woman, um, to allow for the likelihood that she will have had more time out
Oh,
in
oh
young
yeah.
children, all that sort of thing, uh, and not just um, take account of publications.
Oh,
And of
yeah, oh,
course,
sure. I mean, looking at all the factors
so
of
I would
making
say that
looking at the individual cases is an important thing when you're appointing someone, and as chair of a
yes, yes,
department. Moreover, looking to try and make sure that you're not having that you are exploring the broadest possible pool of candidates,
Yes.
but requiring the appointment process to ultimately match the demographics of the underlying society seems to me to be a danger.
Well, that would be the target, but they
Yeah.
shouldn't. But I think that it's. I mean, in academia, in
Hmm.
fact, and I include academies in this,
Yeah.
the shift towards gender balance has been much slower than in other walks of life. And the reason for that is that in academia, decisions are made on the basis of cumulative achievement. And if that's the case, then someone who's had a career gap has a
Sure.
lifelong handicap.
Oh, yeah, I
That's
agree
not
with that.
that's not true in most other jobs. If you're appointing people in many other careers, you want to know what are they going to do in the next 5 years. You don't care in detail
But do you
about
think
that.
that do you really think that, I mean, in the modern, I'm not talking 30, 40 years ago, do you think in the modern world that has any impact? I mean, right now,
Yes,
right now it's true that the dominant number of people getting, first of all, in the US, the gender ratio is 60% women, 40% men in universities as undergraduates, and in terms of
it's not.
PhDs in all of science, by far more in almost every field. When I mean, in all of science, there's some fields where there are more men. It's more women, and the appointments are, and so I think you're absolutely right that there have been that there have been inequities in the past, but do you think that they still exist?
Well, I think they exist at the senior level,
Mm.
because for the reason I said that there were tremendous inequities. Well, when we were students, I mean, I think
Yes.
Caltech didn't
Well,
take women graduate students until the late 1960s.
yeah.
Um,
So it's a little
and so,
younger, but yeah, okay.
so if you're electing people to an academy when they tend to be at least middle aged,
Yeah.
they are
The
the
average
people
age is
who,
deceased, I think, and some one friend colleague of mine told
yes,
me.
yeah.
Anyway.
So they will have had a handicap as their gender, and of course, I think even uh, even when there is a full balance,
Mm.
then I think one's going to have to allow for the fact that career breaks are going to be more for women than for men, and that. And therefore, it's never going to be fair to women if you simply look at total citations or um, total number
Well,
of papers.
yes, although I think you're making the assumption that the career breaks at some point won't be more equitably distributed between males and females in terms
I
of
think that never happened. Yeah,
child rearing. You don't think it'll
yeah,
ever
yeah.
happen that men will?
No,
Because I
no,
happen
no.
to, I'm
Mm.
talking about a case where I fought to get of a guy who had been denied tenure, and it turned out that he had taken a year to take care of the family situation, and
Yeah,
argued that
yeah,
in his case he should be considered like anyone else. And happily, he
yeah,
was
yeah,
reconsidered,
yeah,
but
yeah,
that
yeah.
does happen.
Yes, yeah.
I've worked on both sides, but in any case, the bottom line is that the point is that it's not, getting back to the more important issue, this membership issue, which is such a vital concern to the national academies that they're worrying about it, is not so
Yes,
important because they spend all that's one of the problems of the national academies is the honorific level, is they spend most of their time. And I remember when I was at Yale, most of the time of my colleagues who were in the national academies was spent making sure their friends got in and their enemies didn't.
yes, yes. Well, I have to say that I think the Royal Society does the elections better
Yeah.
because in the Royal Society, the decisions on who to elect from the shortlist is made by a committee, um, which has all of whose members have read 6 reference letters about each of the candidates they're talking about. Whereas in the National Academy, all the members of the Academy in the particular field of study have a vote, and many of them only know the universities people are at. They don't know their work. So I do think that there are some deficiencies in the way the election process goes. But I think I'm disagreeing with you in that I think it's appropriate to make some special provisions for
Uh,
women.
well, I don't agree. I don't disagree. I just always worry about requiring demographic quotas. I think individual cases need to be. Everyone should be examined individually
Yeah, yeah.
and reviewed on merit based on their own life experience. And I think that's the appropriate
Yes,
way to.
and it's all right if the experience includes not just published papers but
Yeah,
all the other
sure.
things. Yeah,
Yeah. No, I think we're in complete agreement. I think if you do that and you look at each candidate, rather
mm,
than ask for some identity from that may be not relevant to their case,
mm,
then and that's my problem of having of requiring general of requiring an abstract general set of guidelines when each case is an individual one. And I
mm.
viewed that when I was hiring, and
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
the most important thing, and especially in any field, but in academia where we have the luxury, we need to look at each person individually and assess their strength in a in a way that's honest and fair.
Yes. But you're really assessing people who will perform well when they get the job. And the past record is only an indicator. And I'm saying it's a biased indicator.
Oh yeah,
And that's
sure.
the
And you know, and in fact, actually, we a colleague of ours, an astronomer, Cormandy, recently got in trouble because he proposed his argument was, and I think a fair one, that we are inevitably biased when we make appointments, and
Mhm.
and I know that when as a chair of a department, I've wanted to hire people sometimes who we could not hire because they just weren't likable, and they basically turned off. They were great at what they did, but they turned off they'd come visit, they'd have a faculty visit, and they turn off most of the people, and that's just, and it's a social endeavor, and you can't expect that not to happen. I mean, it's just the property of human interactions that some some people who would be excellent scientists, researchers, and maybe even okay teachers turn off their colleagues, and that is going to impact on their both their employment opportunities and their promotion opportunities.
Yes. But that's difficult, whether that's right or not.
What's difficult? What do you mean? Whether it's right that?
Whether that should be a factor.
Oh, it shouldn't be. I agree. I'm see. I happen to like cantankerous people, so for me, it doesn't bother me so much. But in any case, okay. Let's. I want to. I want to. You've been very generous to your time, and I want to try and wrap this up a little bit. But I do want to get to the last part of your of which is attracting talent both at the professional level and education, which is something far broader. Trying to make sure we educate the public. Um, we've talked about some of the things that get in the way um, of attracting talent. You've made the point that I remember in the United States, you make the point of you said in my Cambridge college, I asked a group of final year engineering students what their career plans were. All but one were headed for finance or management consultancy, which was a problem. And I remember my daughter was in high school that she, uh, 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 her brightest peers were all interested in finance because there were huge amounts of money to be made in finance, and they would have been exceptional, and some of them were very talented technically, um, and but but on the other hand, it's okay. One year when I taught at Yale, our entire class of theoretical physics PhDs in particle physics went to Wall Street, but that was okay because there weren't jobs in academia anyway. Um, but we need to think of ways to make it more attractive. And you've talked about some of the ways that young people need to be need to be validated and encouraged uh, early on in their careers to have a sense of value. Other things that you think are important and also understanding that different aspects of their activities are valuable and not just publishing papers.
Yeah, yeah.
Anything
Yes.
else?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think you mentioned salaries, and I think there are these grotesque inequalities, and that's why I said early on that we should learn more from Scandinavia and less from the United States and Britain, because we now have these huge inequalities between the finance sector salaries and those in academia, indeed salaries in the entire public sector, which are on the whole far more socially useful than working for a hedge fund, which is socially useless or even damaging, and crypto is certainly damaging. So the fact is that the distribution of wealth is grotesquely unequal, and that's having um, uh, downsides not simply in terms of being unjust and unethical, but it's not optimally deploying the talents of people, because uh, if people go into professions or into government, on the whole, they will do some good. they're bright. Whereas if they go into to crypto or hedge fund, it's not that they are getting 10 or even 100 times as much money, but it's not clear to me to what extent they are benefiting the rest of us, and they are leading to a society with distorted values and production slanted towards producing luxury goods. And it's rather interesting that luxury goods shares have held up better than others during the pandemic, and the richest man in the world is now the French guy who sells expensive handbags, etc.
What do you, in that context, though, what do you think about the way in the United States that people retain or encourage talented people? Is there are there at the highest level, academic salaries can be extremely large. I think in England they aren't that way. I think they're more regimented, and people justify that as a way of retaining people and encouraging some people to go into academia because and it's the way different universities steal people from other people, because it becomes that kind of free market. And it's not that way in England. How do you view that in academia?
Well, it's going a bit that way in Britain, but at a lower level. But I think it's unfortunate, really. And the only reason it's the case is that these jobs in finance are being paid so much more that it is distorting the market. It's not just academia that's being harmed. The civil service. I mean, in the UK Treasury, the mean age of the staff is very young, because most of those aged 35 can probably get 5 or 10 times the salary by moving into banks or something like that. And so we're all losing through this massive inequality. It's not just academia. It's public service generally.
Okay, and what about you talk about you say a further off-putting trend in many countries is the pervasive audit culture and the deployment of ever more detailed performance indicators to quantify our outputs. That's certainly a put-off. The amount of paper that needs to be done to do anything instead of just being left alone to do your work, which is what most faculty would like.
In your country, you don't have quite the same system as we do, but it's certainly true that in academia, certainly in the economics, you've got to have published papers in a particular set of journals in order to be taken seriously. And that, I think, is not optimal, really. And it's going to encourage lots of bright young economists to go and be journalists or such like. So that's one point I'd make. And in the UK, we have bureaucracy, which means that even if you're in one of these sort of elite departments, then the amount of time you get for research is less than it used to be. And also there are so-called research assessment exercises, which means that you've got to produce a certain amount of stuff within any 3-year period. And so this incentivizes very long-term projects. And so one thing which I have written articles about recently, although it's only briefly mentioned in the book, is whether it's perhaps no longer as true as it was that the research university, which was invented by Humboldt of Germany in about 1820, is the best way. I mean, traditionally, that's what we've got in the best UK universities and the best American universities, where people can do research in a fairly freewheeling way. They can get resources and they can do long-term projects. That's less easy now. They're more constrained. And I think we're moving to a stage when many of the best researchers are going to want to be in full-time research institutions. I mean, there's some in the US and in the UK, we have some very strong ones. In medical research, we have the famous molecular biology lab in Cambridge and others like that, which provide better conditions for long-term blue skies research than any university does now. And
Yeah, no, I mean they're much more attractive, and universities become more and more onerous because of
yes,
the regulations. And I don't want to dwell on this, but I do want to ask because I don't know if it's the case in the UK. I want to move to the teaching at the very end here, but um, the one of the things that's becoming more and more difficult for scientific young scientists is these requirements now. Most to get a job, to get a faculty position or a grant, you have to
yes,
demonstrate that you've been actively involved in encouraging inclusivity, diversity, and equity. And you have to actually write a long statement. And
mhm,
in regardless of the fact that some string theorist who's been, been a graduate student working on equations in 11 dimensions, and then does exceptional mathematical work as a postdoc, in order to be able to apply, it has to show how the work they're doing they've actively been contributing to that, and that's a farce. I mean,
yes,
and
yeah,
it will dissuade. Not that these aren't important issues, but it's not a central facet of the training, or should it necessarily be the academic training of someone in certain scientific disciplines, and that's
yeah.
turning people off in the United States anyway.
It is imposed by the university or by the NSF.
It's both. The NSF
Well,
is now doing it, but the universities are doing it more. I did a study of last year of 25 job announcements in physics, and 24 of them required a detailed statement showing how one in a wide variety of areas, that showing how one's work and one's activities have contributed
mm,
to, uh,
yes,
explicitly to that.
yes. No, as we said earlier, I mean, the department as a whole should be doing that, but some individuals are bad at it and some are good at it.
Yeah, exactly. Nor can we expect a junior faculty member or a postdoc to have the experience or expertise to necessarily know enough to be able to have done significant work in that area.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, a young scientist. It's what, like, as a communicator, I had young scientists. Many of them say, "How can I do what you've done, in your
Mhm,
life or whatever?" And I always tell them the same: if you're a good young scientist, do science. That's what you should be
mhm,
doing. And then, if there are opportunities, will arise for you to write or communicate if
yeah,
that's your interest. But if
yeah,
you have a talent, you should be doing that, and then you'll have the opportunities later on, if to make the world a better place in different ways.
mhm,
Whether it's increasing diversity or increasing communication.
yeah, yeah,
Your agreement? Okay. But now
yes,
let me ask you about teaching, which is the last part of the book, and one that's probably teaching and education in general. And I think the statement you make about research institutions could be made more generally. It was a revelation to me when I spent time in Switzerland, to realize that in Switzerland they encourage only 15% of the students in high school to on to university. I
mhm,
used to
mhm,
think of university as something we should encourage everyone to go to, but I've now
mhm,
come around, and I think for most people, university is not necessarily even if the best intellectual course. That for many people, most of the students I see go into universities have no idea why they're there. It's 4 years of more or less, country club living, and before they go out in the real world, and that targeted institutions that targeted skills, uh, uh, and interests, like they do in Switzerland, might be a better solution for many people. What do you think of that?
yes. Well, I think that's true, but I also think that everyone in the universities should have a somewhat broader curriculum.
Ah,
Uh,
yes.
well, in America, you do have majors and minors and all
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
In the UK, we have a more serious problem, a narrow curriculum. We have fairly narrow in universities, in most cases, but worse than that, in high schools, we have specialization at the age of 16, where you can drop science completely. Um,
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, in England, that was the thing.
and
You could have a physics degree and just take physics classes or something,
yes,
you
yeah,
could never do that in the States. And by the way, that
no,
was we used to have this. That was one of the reasons why I was excited once in working in a university in England, or lecturing in it, which you didn't like because it was a private university. But the attraction to me at the time was it was the first UK university that looked like a liberal arts college to me. It was a private university. It's no longer that, but
yes, yes,
and students of all types, for example, had to take some science literacy, which is what I
yes,
taught.
yes.
But I think it's certainly, we're seeing it more and more. that need to specialize early on. And that does turn off some people and also gives you an impediment because it means if you haven't specialized early on, you're at a disadvantage compared to some people who have. And some
Well,
people may not
universities
have
have,
gone to a high school that allowed them to. Sorry, go on.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, certainly in England, the specialisation at the age of 16 last 2 years. And one downside of this is that if you're badly taught science before the age of 16 and you drop it, then that forecloses the option of moving on at 18 to a university where you could specialize in science.
Yeah,
And
it's
so
that's
that's obviously bad, but far better to have something more like the International Baccalaureate, where you have a wide menu as a curriculum all the way up to 18. But then, of course, the universities have to play ball to the extent of lowering their requirements of how much you know in your what's going to be your major area. And so
yeah, and I
requires
think in
both.
the
And so
absolutely
both
and
these things are needed in Britain. And also the other point is that we shouldn't fetishize the level reached after a 3 or 4 year bachelor's degree
yeah.
and allow people to drop out with dignity after 2 years and come back in and move around. And I'm glad to say in Britain there is a move towards this now, and to give people a grant for a total of 3 years at any stage in their life, so they can.
That would be that. I mean that was a suggestion in your book, which I found amazing. The idea,
Mm,
I think, the whole thing that we want to encourage is lifelong learning. This notion that somehow you stop learning in university or in high school is just the worst thing, because most of
yeah.
us, and I've said it, I'll say it to you. I don't know if it's the same for you, but I certainly learned much more physics after my PhD than before.
Oh yeah,
And
me too.
and
Mm,
and in my case, I've been a professor of astronomy as well as physics. But while it may be apparent to you, it won't be apparent to many others. I never took an astronomy course in my life as an
mm,
undergrad.
yeah,
As I,
yes.
I learned it all after the fact. But
Mm, mm,
what little I know, and a lot of it I learned from you, of course. But anyway, um, uh, but what about this? So lifelong learning is important, and and offering people the opportunities. One of the reasons I chose the university I did, a personal case, is that I liked physics and I liked science, but I liked history. And my that university offered what was called a general science course, where you could do equal numbers of courses, and it attracted me. Ultimately, I discovered that I had to specialize eventually, and I moved.
mm,
After a couple of years, I went into math and physics, but
mm,
that
mm.
attractiveness to people who don't know what they want to do is
Yes,
particularly important because not everyone knows what they want to do when they're 18.
yes. And of course, many are going to be generalists in their career. They're going to go into business or
Yeah.
government service. Then um, they're not going to be specialists, and therefore, the broader the background they've acquired at university, the better.
Now, in terms of improving as you point out, we need to have better teachers. The real problem, as you say, ultimately in education is at lower levels, is trying to educate young people,
Yes.
and we need to do that more effectively, as well as as well as providing people the opportunity, as you point out, for lifelong learning. And I think the idea of giving people grants so they can spend 3 years at a later time in education is unbelievably interesting, especially as people live longer,
Mhm,
and we don't necessarily want everyone in the workforce at the same time.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
but uh, but what do you think about in terms of getting back to this question of salaries? In order to in science, frankly, one of the problems of having, I know in the public education system, of getting good science teachers is that most of the people who are trained in science have better and opportunities with more money to work somewhere else. And therefore, I've argued that not that while science may not be more intrinsically useful than art history, that you or maybe or so English, or I certainly don't think it is. You probably have to pay at in the public education system science teachers more in order to make it attractive, because simply they have other options that an English major might not have. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's a pity if you have to have differential salaries. But from what I know, in many states, American teacher salaries are extremely low.
Yeah,
So I'm not
all
surprised they find it hard to attract people. So I think an overall raise in the level is going to be
absolutely.
important.
And then you
I
point
think
out that the real
that-
thing is not just teaching in schools, but teaching outside of schools and the need for scientists to reach out broader. I think that's one of the main messages of your book from beginning to end is that scientists not only should take an interest in policy at government level, but again, not every scientist, but the scientific community should be working hard to reach out beyond the traditional realm of education, but to the public at large, because they're the ones
yeah,
who ultimately need to make the decisions in electing
yes,
politicians or creating advocacy groups. As
yes,
I say,
yeah,
3% of the population gets interested in something, and I think
mhm,
you've argued very strongly for that we need that holistic approach, and we need scientists to speak out, and we also need to have information more accessible. I think one of the things that you point out, which is really interesting, is that in physics, in science, we have this thing called the archive, which makes
mhm,
all for information that's happening in science. Anyone can go on,
yeah,
and I often recommend even on Twitter that people go to the archive to see something, whether they'll understand or not. At least they have
mhm,
the opportunity to go to it. But such things don't exist in the humanities. So that
right,
such,
right, yeah.
and what can we do?
Yes, but I think more generally the role of online versus live teaching in universities is an open question. I mean, I know the other university in Arizona, ASU, of course,
Yeah,
pioneered this, and I admire hugely what they do. And I think these so-called MOOCs, massive
yeah,
online learning, I think as standalone uh, activities, they only work for mature part-time vocational courses. You know,
yeah,
people who want to learn some special techniques. But on the other hand, I think they can be a feature of a university course. I mean, and
yeah,
I would say that if you think of a typical university course, I don't think much would be lost if the basic big lectures that may be given to a class of 200 or 300 are online, because there's no real feedback during the lecture, and and I think if they're well prepared and online,
yeah.
and then of course if they're especially good, then they can be made available publicly. And I'm not, and certainly in Cambridge, I think we should do that. We don't want to set up satellite campuses in the Middle East or
Yeah,
like that, but to make available freely, especially good lecture courses. Well, just like MIT made Walter Lewin's physics
yeah, yeah,
course.
yeah,
Then that's a good thing, and it's good for the university. Just like if a professor writes a good textbook which is widely used, that's a positive thing for the university. And so, in the same way, I think if the big lectures were more carefully prepared and were widely used in universities around the world where they don't have such a strong faculty, that would be great.
that'd be great. If and the problem with the university is they want to get some financial, it's always finances, and they want to
No,
charge
but,
people.
yes, but they don't if you write a textbook.
No, I agree with you. I'm just saying the reality. Having been involved in this very issue at that university,
Yes,
I will tell you that online courses were viewed as much as a money-making activity as much as a pedagogical
yes,
tool. And
yes.
that's the unfortunate thing. But I think you're absolutely right. But then, of course, I think where we both agree is that that a purely online education is not a good, not can't compete. And that's true at all levels. The
With
saddest
all of
part of the
them.
pandemic was so many
Yes,
young kids
yes.
missed that experience of direct interaction,
At
community
the school
interaction.
level, school level, of course, you need the real interaction, and I think at undergraduate level, you have the flipped classroom and the tutorials and things. That's fine, but I think it's the big lecture where there's
Yeah.
no feedback really.
And then the biggest lecture being the biggest audience being the world, and that scientists need to
Yeah,
communicate and reach out and get people excited. And I think one of the things that I admire about you so much, besides your distinction as a scientist, and I told you earlier on that I used to, I'll tell you publicly now that when I was first learning astronomy for the use in physics, I learned that there were certain people whose writings I could go to and I could trust, and you were one of them. And I think
yes.
that
Well,
was
thank you very much.
incredibly valuable to me. But let me end with the last quote from your book, which is the quote from Margaret Mead. which is that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, is the only thing that ever has. I'm not sure if I agree with the second part, but I think the first part is very important, and I think we're all very lucky that you're one of that small group of thoughtful, committed citizens who are trying to change the world.
I think you've got to actually be more charismatic and interact with the wide public via the media. And that's why one has to admire people like David Attenborough, etc.
Absolutely.
And Carl Sagan.
And Carl Sagan. And I think it's what I know it's what motivates a number of us. And anyway, thank you for taking the time. I tried to, there's so many interesting ideas there. I wanted to do justice to them, and I think it'll be the conversation will be very useful for many people. And it's always a pleasure. And I know it's very late for you right now. And thank you for even focusing for so long on this. It's always a pleasure.
Okay, well, good to be in touch.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation, a non-profit organization whose goal is to enrich your perspective of your place in the cosmos by providing access to the people who are driving the future of society in the 21st century and to the ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world. To learn more, please visit originsprojectfoundation.org.